Good afternoon. It's a real pleasure to be here. Just to echo Kristen, it's so exciting to be back together in person. And before we start, I just want to say we did bring a copy of our book if anyone wants to look at it afterwards. It's here, and we're really excited to be sharing a lot of our discoveries here with you today. We began working on, well, I guess both of us began working on studying Life magazine a couple decades ago, but found each other in 2016. I had proposed an exhibition here at the MFA about 10 years ago, and it was initially accepted but hadn't quite gotten off the ground, and Kate and I were at a conference together in Toronto in 2016, and she introduced herself and said, I'm doing a big Life magazine show and I'm looking for an institutional partner. And so when I introduced myself, I said, let's have lunch. This could be really exciting. So it's been a wonderful collaboration between Kate at the Princeton University Art Museum and myself here at the MFA, and our third co-curator, who you will hear from next week, who is Alyssa Shapiro, independent curator and PhD candidate at Northwestern University. And so we are going to go over the structure of our exhibition, sharing multiple discoveries. We hope that you'll have a chance to see the exhibition and hopefully also look through our book. And we're really excited that next week you'll hear from Alyssa Shapiro, and the following week you'll hear from Caitlin Ryan, who's currently at the Museum of Modern Art. She has been working on the project since 2017 or 2018. She was an intern and then a fellow and has worked both at the MFA and at Princeton and has been a huge part of our research collaboration, and also wrote an essay in our book. And she's either PhD candidate or recently finished at Princeton, finished. And so she got her PhD in history of photography at Princeton. And then our final lecture is by Dahlia Linson, who is also a photo historian who we invited to contribute to this catalog, and also head of academic engagement here at the MFA. So understanding that there was a new wealth of information available, and actually Kate's going to talk about the specific archives, but just knowing the access we were going to have and the support from our institutions, we set out to do a very ambitious book, and which Princeton was incredibly supportive of and helped us support us in getting to work with 25 different contributors. One of the things we talked about a lot was everywhere you read about Life magazine, it talks about how the photo essay or the use of photography was seminal, distinctive, groundbreaking. But every commentary about Life magazine from an academic point of view, and even in museums, was really from the point of view of American studies or political science, and it was very rarely truly within the history of photography and looking at those actual photographs. And so we set out to invite many different people to help us put together this very comprehensive selection of discoveries and research. And so our scholars that contributed to the book are from art history, American studies, history, media studies, and more. The book has both thematic essays and specific case studies, ranging from the roles of women at Life magazine to the feat of its technologically advanced printing, and also its timeliness as a weekly magazine. And I should note, I think if you're here today with us, we know that we all in this room agree about the importance of thinking about the physicality of photographs and the importance of the picture magazines in the 20th century. Our overarching really sort of theme is to help show and shed a light on the collective efforts that went into creating the photojournalism in Life magazine. And so this is here a selection of our table of contents. And quickly before I hand it over to Kate, I want to point out this photograph that, as I mentioned, we really want to talk about the collaborative nature of Life magazine and all photojournalism in the 20th century. So from the start, Life hoped to distinguish itself among other picture magazines by driving their commitment to photography through their circulation, and photo stories became the real backbone of the operation. The magazine was a weekly magazine from 1936 to 1972, and in that time, Life featured 120,000 photo stories selected from around 10 million photographs. So we started by considering approximately 350 different photo stories that were created by over 200 staff, contract, and freelance photographers. We knew we wanted select photographs and photo stories that covered major themes by the magazine, such as war, race, technology, art, celebrity, and national identity. But our question to ourselves was, how do you build an exhibition and create a scholarly book when you don't know what's out there and what exists?
So hopefully this is the exhibition you've either seen or are about to see. And this question of what might be out there led us to, here's another view of the exhibit, led us to the two archives that are the main repositories of material. The first, as you see on the slide here, is New York Historical Society, which is now the home of the Time Inc. archive, which arrived there in 2015 and was just beginning to be cataloged in 2016 when we began our collaboration. And this was, we decided to do a case study of what the archives might yield if we were able to pull off this exhibition. And so we went to the archivist at New York Historical Society, who luckily had been the archivist at Time Inc. for 40 years, and we said, what do you have in relation to the very first cover of Life magazine? This first cover is one that appears in countless photo history texts. It is heralded as this new era of picture magazines in the US, but we wanted to know what archival materials might shed new light on this really iconic, famous cover. And what he shared with us were Margaret Bourke-White's telegrams, Western Union telegrams, back to the editorial team at Life magazine's headquarters in New York City, where you see Bourke-White working through the struggles, the opportunities that present themselves on site at Fort Peck Dam in Montana. So she talks about the community there. She talks about the nightlife among the builders, the workers on this dam. And here she is bemoaning the changeable light, which of course the light plays this incredible role on this photograph she takes of Fort Peck Dam. So this is one archive. This is the New York Historical Society. This is the paper archive of Time Inc. Incorporated. So this is financials, internal memos, letters to the editor, subscription records, right? This is the sort of paper administrative archive. The second archive is the Life picture collection. And this is an archive that actually is still privately held today. And when we went to them for this exercise, this sort of test in 2016 regarding this famous cover, we said, what can you show us from your archive that might shed new light on it? We discovered that this famous photograph, which I think everyone in our field had always thought Margaret Bourke-White photographed vertically, was actually a horizontal shot. So what you're seeing on the left-hand side is Life magazine's Photo Lab print of her full negative, which you see is horizontal, which you see shows much more of the dam. And importantly, we also got to see the back side of this photograph, which shows all the ways in which it circulated. So this is what we call a press print. That is a photograph that was printed in the publication offices for the publication use. So it was not maybe the revered document that we might think it was a working document, and these stamps and annotations and check marks and tape all reflect the life of this image as it went through the various steps of production at the magazine. And this is one of the kinds of material that we're really excited to be able to showcase in this exhibit because of the access to these two archives. It also is worth noting that, the fact that Burke White was known for really not allowing her images to be cropped. She was brought on as one of the first 4 staff photographers at Life magazine when it debuted in 1936, and she had previously done a ton of photography for Henry R. Luce's publication Fortune. And so she was known that as someone who did not want her images cropped. So the idea that this is cropped was a pretty big revelation. So between what we saw at the Historical Society and what we saw at Life Picture Collection with this one test case, we thought, okay, we're onto something. And with that, we really launched into thinking about how to frame this project. And one of the key things that we wanted to stress was that Life magazine wasn't sort of born or imagined in a vacuum. It has precursors, and what I'm showing you on screen is one of those, is sort of the inspiration from these precursors, European picture magazines, which were really predominant in the later 20s into the early 30s. And a number of the people who worked on these picture magazines, especially German editors who had to flee the rise of the Nazis, end up in the US. And Henry R. Luce hires them, puts them in what he calls an experimental picture department, and they start generating work like what you see on screen, where they're trying to imagine for a US market a brand new kind of weekly magazine that will foreground photography in innovative ways. And so you see the playfulness of the layout where, like the leapfrog photo, the man's head, bursts into the imagined title of the magazine. Here, they just put the word dummy, but this playfulness where photos literally can obscure the text of the title of the magazine. And on the right, you see they're playing with photo layouts and how an arrangement of photographs on the page can tell the story, and where the text becomes secondary, more minimal. So you get the idea of maybe a sort of header for the spread, Love in the Year 2000, but the whole page is predominantly given over to photographs to orient the viewer, to get them interested in the story at hand. And I have to say that these objects, these prototypes, if you will, these imaginary experiments of what will become Life magazine had never been published before. So we're really honored to be able to showcase these for the first time in the exhibit and in the book.
And in fact, just to give you the context of those objects in the exhibition, when you walk in, the very first section is really about the founding of Life magazine. And so you'll see some of the European precedents, and you'll see this wonderful work that Kate just spoke about. And following the founding of Life magazine, the exhibition is divided into 3 historical sections. And I should just mention here, for those of you that have already seen it or about to, for the MFA presentation of the exhibition, we did integrate 3 contemporary moments. We're not focusing on those today, but I just wanted to, I might make reference at a couple moments while we're talking. But so the core of the historical show has these 3 sections. And the first section is very much about how the photographs were made, and it's called Getting the Picture. And then section 2 is how meaning is made on the page through the photographs and their placement and the decisions made. And then section 3 is about Life's photographic impact.
All right, so here's a great installation shot of the first section, which again is really about what is possible when we're looking at how the pictures came to be, how they came to exist for Life magazine. So an example of this is the photographer Gordon Parks here getting off a plane, a reminder that, you know, the photographic network for Timing and Life magazine was vast. And you see here, you know, he has not one, but two cameras slung around his neck. He is following his photographic subject, a young boy named Flavio, who lives in South America. So we're talking about an international circuit of photographers traveling to get their story. But I think really important is to note that there's yet another Life photographer at this scene taking this photograph to document how Life gets its pictures, right? And Life was very aware of the power and the prestige that it brought to this securing of photos for its pages. But a photographer like Gordon Parks would frequently work with a researcher to create a story building team. They would then head out, usually paired with a reporter, with guidelines, a kind of outline, or sometimes a more specific shooting script in hand. Once the assignment began, and you'll see examples of this in the exhibit, the focus of the story might shift. So they were allowed to be responsive while out on assignment. And on-the-spot decisions actually become an essential part of Life's picture-making process. At the end of the shoot, the photographer and the reporter team would send their undeveloped rolls of film and their notes to Life's offices to be developed into negatives and then printed onto contact sheets. So one of the things that's really important to stress is, like, that might be the last time that a photographer like Gordon Parks saw his film, which is to say he might never see the contact sheets, he might never see the prints. That all then gets absorbed into Life's offices and is part of the process we'll talk about today. The notes that a reporter would type up were called caption files, and these offered details about what the editors would see in the images. And so they're also tracking the film. So there's wonderful examples where a caption file will say, roll 15, around frame 30, look for X, Y, and Z. And so it's like the reporter's guide for the editors about what's unfolding across every roll of film and sometimes every frame. Excuse me. So one example of where we trace this in section 1 is a story that will become Nurse Midwife. Here I'm showing you a page of that shooting script. So this is an example when a sort of detailed shooting script was devised. I'm also showing a section of the contact sheets available from that shoot, and then one of the press prints. So this is I'm going to go over this in brief because this is going to be part of what Dahlia Linson will discuss with all of you for the final lecture in this course. But I think important to note that it begins with this editorial idea about nurse midwives in the US South, who are primarily Black women working in incredibly impoverished communities. And in the shooting script, you see a kind of elite New York idea about what these old grannies do. The editors assigned this story to photographer W. Eugene Smith, and he chose, before embarking on the assignment, to take a 2-week midwifery course in preparation. So it gives you an idea of the kind of duration of some of these assignments. And then after interviewing several different midwives, he selected nurse midwife Maud Callan, the woman you see on the far right here in the large print, and he shadowed her for nearly a month in rural South Carolina. For this one story, he shot 2,600 negatives of Maud Callan at work, including her delivering babies, teaching other Black midwives at the state-run Midwifery Institute, passing out clothing, taking care of her community, occasionally moments of respite, but they're few and far between for her. And one of the things that we also gained access to is Smith's reports back to Life editors while he's still on the ground in South Carolina about what his own aspirations are for the published story. Again, a reminder, he doesn't control the final published story. He can only offer up his hopes for it. And he really wants this story to expose what he called in one of those letters, quote, the stupidity of racial prejudice, end quote.
So another case study within this first section of the exhibition on getting the picture is about shooting war photographs. And so I'll now talk about both Robert Capa, who photographed this image here, and also, excuse me, Larry Burroughs. So I should mention in a more general sense, after World War II, Henry R. Luce, the editor, observed, and this is a quotation, although we did not plan Life as a war magazine, it turned out that way. And at this moment, I want to call out our essay in the book on conflict photography by scholar Liam Kennedy, who points out that it was much more intentional than it sounds, being a war magazine. And a great deal of Life's editorial and creative energies went into its coverage of World War II, as well as wars and international conflicts beyond 1945. So even though Life was apparently not intended to be a war magazine per se, war and conflict really became ideal focal points of the magazine's worldviews, and also contributed to its popularity as such a popular picture magazine. So in order to cover conflict, Life-affiliated photographers were necessarily embedded with military, and what that means is that Life photographers would go and really live with these military units. They would have the same status as them. And so their photographs, of course, are going to be coming also from their perspective. And that's an important thing to consider as we look at these photographs. And so we have two examples, both Capa and Burroughs, who were embedded. And here we see American soldiers landing on Omaha Beach on D-Day in Normandy, France on June 6, 1944. The photograph here shows us the Allied invasion of Normandy, and I want to just point out more than 500 media personnel were prepared for the invasion, though only very few would actually accompany the landing at Omaha Beach. And so here, Robert Capa was one of those people. He was accompanying the 16th Regiment of the 1st Infantry Division on this second assault wave, and his photographs really capture a complete sense of chaos, panic, and paralysis. The legendary assault represented here is considered one of the largest seaborne attacks in history. And as we note in this photograph, the grainy blur really conveys the frenetic feel of the action, and I think we can probably all agree, contributes to the collective memory that we all have when we associate that when we think about this day and the violent chaos that's described. So, as Kate talked about, this idea of having your rolls of film, sending them in, today only 11 of Robert Capa's photographs of the invasion are known today. Capa claimed to have shot more than 100 frames, however, very few remain. The way that Capa and others, such as picture editor John Morris, told the story after the war, and on John Morris's, in John Morris's case, till the end of his life, he died at age 100, he told the story over and over about how in London because the rolls of film were sent to London, and apparently everyone was in such a rush to develop them that they actually got destroyed in the process of rushing to develop them. There's great debate about that, and the accuracy of the story has been questioned many times. There's very interesting research done by historian A.D. Coleman, and I'm sure you could all learn a lot about it, but the impact and the importance for us here is to look at that process. And so these are among the very few surviving images from that day and from Kappa. And what's important, and what Kate had explained, the idea of the caption files. So we have reporters and photographers taking very detailed notes about each frame that they took. And what's fascinating here, so this is a caption file, and we really are, fascinated to see here. You can see there's actually a razor, scissors, or whatever it was, to literally censor this document, and then we have a stamp on it saying pass for publication. And so this gives us a sense, yet again, as Kate mentioned, the photographer sort of lets go, they send off their notes, and then this document is in the hands of government, it eventually gets to life, but we can sort of see the distance between the photographer taking the image and then ultimately when the photograph is published. And so it's a reminder that photographers sent undeveloped film. In this case, they went to London, or it would be the nearest bureau, or New York directly. So the caption file and the negatives are very important parts of the process. And I now am going to move on to our next example, which is Larry Burroughs. And so we've moved forward in time. Larry Burroughs photographed the war in Vietnam from 1962 until his death in Laos in 1971. And his work really constitutes a very important documentary chronicle of this conflict and became very influential for years to come. A quote by Burroughs is, "You can't photograph bullets flowing through the air, so it must be the wounded or people running loaded with ammunition and the expressions on their faces." So here we have an injured soldier at the center reaching towards a wounded Marine who lies before him. The man, covered in mud and bandaged on both legs, is propped up against a tree stump, his left arm cast towards the viewer and gripping another tree stump. Here we have a real sense of symbolic references that sort of, it looks almost like a tableau, and you'll see it's a large photograph as well in the exhibition, and so you really get a sense of the immediacy of this scene here. By 1971, the photograph then, and actually I'm not gonna get ahead of myself, I wanna just point out the Vietnam War, which was presented in different ways in the magazine, was a very long, costly, and divisive conflict that pitted communist government of North Vietnam against South Vietnam and its principal ally, the United States. The conflict was greatly intensified by the ongoing Cold War between the US and the Soviet Union. And I should note, although we're focusing on war right now, that the Cold War was also very present in the magazine. And my essay in the book is on the Cold War. And so I want to just point out, one of the editors at Time Inc. in February 1966 in an editorial, this is Hedley Donovan, he wrote, "Vietnam begins to dominate the public life of the United States and the private thoughts of many an American family." And so here, this was really the intersection that life had of addressing this connection between the public and private sphere. And the war became a prominent topic in its weekly publications. So as we either remember or know, the 1960s in general is filled with dissent and protest across the world and in the United States, of course. And editors really struggled as to whether or not to reflect increasing public disaffection with the war or to kind of work on American public opinion. Larry Burroughs was there, and these intense and powerful photographs were being published. So I want to note the harrowing images, thinking about this idea of the embedded photographer, and then this is a particularly interesting photograph that we were fascinated to find because on the right, we see this young woman here with 2 cameras. In looking into it, we learn she's French photographer Katherine Leroy, who had gone completely on her own. She's very different than Larry Burroughs, and she was working independently. She found what today we would call a fixer, someone to help set her up, and so she was there in a very different capacity. But what's fascinating here is that when Life magazine publishes the image, they've cut her out of it. So again, this sort of question of staging the war, and what we've been excited to uncover are all these images and further context about how the photographs were actually made. I want to also just note Larry Burroughs. His work is incredibly important, not only for the form and composition that we see in his images, his harrowing effect, but also through the color and new technologies that he's using. So finally, and I'm going a little beyond what the exhibition covers because we wanted to also talk about the impact. So here, this is a very important story that is from June 27th, 1969, and as we see here, it says, "The Faces of American Dead in Vietnam, 1 week's toll." So this issue included the gallery you see here of photographs of US soldiers killed in Vietnam during just the week of May 28th to June 3rd. The 217 images published in the format of studio portraits were made up of high school photographs, graduation shots, and formal military pictures. Most of them were provided by the families of the deceased. So the images were shocking due to the intimacy and just having them all together and the volume of them. And so in terms of the context of the war, the faces of these young men staring out at viewers implied innocence that belied their fate. As many noticed, the presentation of the images resembled that of an American high school yearbook. And so here we have the editorial behind this presenting something in a very different way now. So we just wanted to note that it really shows an editorial shift and a kind of drawing support away from the war, although this had gradually been happening for the few years before. And a very important point, Henry Luce had stepped down as editor-in-chief of all of his publications in 1964. However, he had maintained a lot of interest, of course, in the magazine and was a belligerent supporter of the US involvement in Vietnam until his death in 1967. And we highly doubt that he would have sanctioned this specific story. So with that, we will go backwards a little bit in time.
Yeah, I think that's a really important point that Kristen just made, that the exhibition, because it's anchored in the photograph and how the photograph operated at Life magazine, it doesn't proceed chronologically. And so section 1 has all these examples, you know, the founding of the magazine in 1936, World War II in 1939, 1945, jumping to Vietnam. Now I'm going to take you back to the first year of the magazine. This is Margaret Burke White going to Louisville to cover a devastating flood there. This is the image that Life magazine editors will select. But we were really curious what it looked like for her to be on the ground shortly after the catastrophic floods, really conducting news photography. This is a story that she wouldn't have had the same kind of time to develop, and it's a more reactive kind of assignment than perhaps what I described earlier with Fort Peck Dam. And so I'm going to take you through some of the negatives here to give you a sense of what she's recording. So we have flooded streets, people in boats because that is the only way they can get around. There's sort of a human interest element that you can see consistently in her negatives. You also start to see a focus on the submerged cars here in the distance, here taking up the entirety of the shot. But you also start to see that she's really interested in the signage in the town, right? So in this one, the car, the billboard's small in the background. This one, the billboards are really the focal point. And if you're looking carefully, you see the submerged car. And again, moving in on that. So what we see in the negatives is that she's starting to create this relay between the signage of the billboards and the effects of the flood. You know, headlights you can see on the billboard, headlights you can't below. Coming back to that human interest, here we see a line of people waiting for food relief. You see the pails, right? This is a photo I especially like because the man gives that sidelong glance, and by the next frame, he's looking dead at her. She follows this line, right? But it still has this oblique composition so that the line stretching into the distance is really arguably the focal point. She tries cropping out their feet and the sidewalk, a little more interest in the billboard behind them, and then she arrives at this. And you see that this is, in many ways, the distillation of all those other negatives. And that was a really wonderful thing for us to realize, that a talented photographer like Margaret Burke-White is, on a boat, up on a bridge, feeling her way through this event until she arrives at this kind of distillation of the elements that are most interesting to her. And this is the image that Life's editors choose to lead off with. This is the lead news story for that week. You can always tell when it's the lead story because it'll have the volume and number stamp, the Life logo, and then on the right-hand side, the date of that week's issue. But importantly, this is a photo that has continued to have a life of its own. Here, I'm showing you a screenshot of New York Times coverage from very early in the pandemic in 2020 that's repurposing this photograph of strife and struggle in an entirely different context today. There are many more negatives than I showed you today, so when you go to the exhibit, if you haven't already, I just want to call out that you'll see them as this projection. We show 16 of the dozens that she took on the projected wall. Next to it is the framed print, and below it, the magazine.
So we now are moving away from how the actual photographers worked and how the photographs were made, and we're moving into the second section of the exhibition, which is all about what happened once the photographer had shot the assignment. So we have multiple editors. There was first a negative editor, or as they called it at the beginning, a film editor, and that person would review negatives that were printed on contact sheets and also caption files in order to select images for enlargement that would then be considered for publication. So those enlarged prints would make it to a photo editor like the woman we see here, Natalie Kozak, surrounded by wonderful piles of photographs, and she and others on a large editorial team would choose the final images for the magazine and the specific story and determine how to adapt them for the printed page. The most elaborate of these would become multi-page photo essays, a visual format that Life claimed to have invented, and we have a wonderful essay by Nadia Baer in our book about that. And the magazine really relied on stunning visuals and minimal text to convey each story. So after the picture editing, Life art directors and layout artists then collaborated with editors, writers, researchers, and fact checkers to construct each and every page. So this editorial process concluded with sending the final layout mock-ups of every page of the magazine from the Life headquarters in New York to Chicago to R.R. Donnelly and Sons, where the magazine would be printed every week using unparalleled technology to achieve the lavish printing on heavy, glossy paper. Here we have a very iconic essay, which we also feature in an essay dedicated to this photograph in our book. And this is a spread from Victory Celebrations, and it's from August 27th, 1945, So on the left here, we see the whole story. And this section of the exhibition asks, how did those photographs get there? Because we know that photographers often shot thousands of frames for a single story, and Life's negative editors and picture editors would have, again, really made some hard choices as to what got shown. So we have here a very exciting discovery that had never been seen before, and we were thrilled upon finding it because you have this strip of negatives with the red grease pencil. And there was one picture or negative editor named Peggy Sargent, who many photographers described as they felt that Peggy Sargent had their careers in the palm of her hands, because she would meticulously look over so many negatives and contact sheets and make different markings, recommend for printing. But here, we don't know if it was specifically Peggy Sargent, but we see the red line, sort of pointing out where and how this photograph will be best used for impact. So I should also note, within this context of the exhibition, we also did a small sort of projection animation that you can see in the exhibition, where we show sort of the process of looking at the negatives and really want to think about all the images that one would have considered to eventually get to this photograph that has become so iconic over the years. And I should note, in fact, there are many, many artists interpreting this and thinking about this image, which we want to always recognize has become controversial over time. Many layers of meaning have been added to it, especially during the Me Too movement. There's controversy as to who's in the photograph, whether there's consent. And there are many artists, including Amory Sherald, whose portrait of Michelle Obama we have on view, who are really thinking a lot about this photograph and creating work based on it. So it's exciting to sort of keep these images relevant and think about their iconicity. One more example here. I mentioned the layout mock-ups, and this has been another very exciting discovery. These had never been on view other than the 3 weeks, and we didn't actually get into that, but this exhibition did open in Princeton in February 2020, but was sadly only on view for a few weeks. So another reason why we're so thrilled that it's actually on the walls here now, finally. But so this had never been published, had never been really even seen or understood. And Kate mentioned earlier this young boy, Flavio, and I'll just give you a brief synopsis of that story. Gordon Parks was assigned to go to Brazil, and he was given a very broad assignment, which was to photograph poverty. He spent time in favelas. He met this family and got to know a young boy who was very sick with a rare form of asthma named Flavio da Silva. And this became a very important story and it's also featured not only here with these layouts, but in the final section of the show, because Gordon Parks' photographs were published, they presented the story, and it actually created a huge outpouring of support and emotion on the part of the US readers who wanted to contribute to bringing Flavio to the United States and going to a specialized clinic in Colorado, where he did actually come. He went for 2 years. He received health care, and Life also sent in money to have a house built for his family in Rio. This story is important on multiple levels. The first is that personally for Flavio da Silva, who's on our audio guide, which I recommend that you all listen to, talks about how it still brings him to tears today at age 73, that this had such an impact on him. And on a sort of geopolitical, much wider and bigger picture, this story was important because, number one, it then instigated multiple other stories, which we're seeing here, and I will get into the actual layout themselves in a moment. But so from a Brazilian point of view, it felt very much like US imperialism had just sort of come in and presented Brazil in this way. And so the Brazilian magazine O Cruzeiro sent a Brazilian photographer to New York and said, please photograph poverty in New York. And so they found a young boy in New York and photographed him and then published a story. And when the story was published, they reproduced the Life pages as well. And so it opened up this larger question of, the role that photography can play at that point was still the Cold War, sort of, the dissuasion techniques or sort of showing what communism could potentially do, but Brazil was very quick to react to that. So there's a lot there to unpack, and I won't go in too much detail, but back to the specific object, we have the final layout here, and you can see, the compassion of Americans brings a new life for Flavio. What is so exciting about this object is we see them experimenting with the different ways of laying out the story. And we also see through the dummy text that there's not a huge importance put on what the words are going to be at this moment. It's really all about how the image is going to be presented. And so we have these three incredible examples of, is it going to be this large image of him in the doctor's office, and how is this going to be presented? And here we have the final view. So it's a very powerful story with multiple layers, and at this point in the exhibition, we're mainly wanting to show the role of the editors deciding how these images are presented and how meaning is created.
I want to bring these ideas about the editors to bear on a very specific image that becomes a photographic spread picturing the violence of the white supremacist bombing of the 16th Street Baptist Church in Birmingham, Alabama, which, as you may know, killed 4 girls nearly 60 years ago. This is the spread. Printed nearly full bleed across both pages in the Life on the News Fronts of the World feature, that was a regular feature, in the September 27th, 1963 issue. This photograph insists on the close study of the cut and bandaged face of Sarah Jean Collins, a 12-year-old girl, one of the 22 people injured by the bomb blast, and the younger sister of one of the 4 murdered girls, Addie Mae Collins. To arrive at this published spread, Life editors, including someone like Peggy Sargent, who Kristen mentioned, selected this photo from nearly 400 images taken by Black photographer Frank Dandridge, who also appears on the audio guide. Frank Dandridge was there following the bombing for 2 weeks, but this photo places Life's mostly white viewers in an intimate confrontation with Collins, a choice that's underscored by our discovery of a variant image in the archives, the one on the left here, in which a man and a woman flank the girl's hospital bed. In the image chosen for publication, we can see that Dandridge chose to occupy the woman's position, so framing the photograph in a way in which he, and therefore Life's viewers, hover over Collins in a bedside vigil of concern. It's important to note that Dandridge gained access to make these photographs in the hospital as a Black photographer who, working with Mark Crawford, a Black Life reporter, gained the trust of Collins's mother, who took Dandridge to the hospital. Dandridge recalls taking photos the second he stepped into the room because they were being harassed by hospital personnel. And so, in fact, the woman we see here is Mrs. Collins, standing at her daughter's bedside, and Dandridge frames the image all the more powerfully because in the chosen image, he steps into literally the position of the mother. So by implication, Life's readers take up Dandridge's position, a bedside concern for the life and future of Sarah Jean Collins, who at this point, the story the caption is very clear. It's not known whether she will ever see again. Now the published spread, another piece of editorial decision, the published spread, An Alabaman's Great Speech Lays the Blame. The text here quotes at length a white Birmingham lawyer, Charles Morgan Jr., from a segregated meeting of the Young Men's Business Club, where he laid blame for the racial violence emphatically. Quote, "Who is really guilty? Each of us," end quote. Why this condemnation from a white Southerner rather than more of Mark Crawford's reporting, or even the words of Collins's mother, whom Crawford certainly interviewed in the days he and Dandridge were assigned to cover Birmingham? We will never know for sure, as these editorial decisions, like so much of the photo story process, often happen verbally, without record, and now lost to history. What we do know is that Life did not set out to address a Black audience. It consistently assumed its audience to be white, comfortably middle class, and urban, concentrated in the Northeast and West Coast of the US. By publishing words from a privileged white man, Life's editors were asking their white readers to listen to another privileged white voice, even as their publishing of Dandridge's powerful photo and the message of the text demanded that they become aware of and invested in the pain that racial violence in the US South created. Life magazine was very consistent in covering civil rights in the 1960s, and so the second example I'm going to talk about from this section about crafting photo stories is one in which the text and the image do not align the way that they did for the Dandridge photo spread. Here I am showing you Charles Moore's photographic coverage of the demonstrations that rocked Birmingham just a handful of months before the bombing I just discussed. This is the opening spread. Again, you can see it's the lead story for that week's news. And while Moore's photo here visually aligns Life's white readers with the attacking firefighters, the article's title, "They Fight a Fire That Won't Go Out," suggests distance from these agents of the state and actually underscores the futility of their actions in a period of intense civic protest by Black Americans. This 11-page story, that's a pretty long photo story, just to flag that. This 11-page story presented not only harrowing images of protesters attacked by fire hoses that were known to be able to strip bark off trees, but they also showed dog attacks on protesters in sequence. Here I'm showing one of those images, but you can see that sequential attack in the published layout. This published layout, however, is paired with a text that suggests that the protesters provoked the attacks, right? We have the phrase "Negro's Reward" as the header for the spread. However, when we look at the archives and we look at that caption file submitted by reporter Mike Durham, we see that the caption file indicts the police for, quote, "moving in with clubs and dogs," end quote. And the caption file specifically notes that protesters threw, quote, "rocks and bricks," end quote, only after battling the firefighters' hoses. So what we have here is a misinterpretation, a willful misinterpretation of the information provided from the reporter on the ground. So although Moore's photographs succeeded in showing that white authorities were the aggressors and Black protesters the victims, the text of this 11-page story quotes no Black participants, and the final page of the story, which I show here on the left, is actually given over to reactions from shaken whites in Birmingham. So together, these two Birmingham stories, the one with Dandridge's photo and the one with Moore's photos, serve as really potent reminders that there was never one editorial agenda, one outlook, or even one Life magazine, but a host of people informing an array of really complex decisions about the messages delivered, both by images and texts on the pages of Life magazine. And again, Life's anticipated reader was very specifically 30 to 34 years old, from the professional and skilled labor classes, college-educated, married, and very likely living in a city. This concentration that I mentioned of Life's readers in the Northeast and the West of the US also meant that Life had this important role to play in raising awareness of civil rights struggles that were mostly unfolding in the US South in the 1960s. And this is the subject of my essay in the book. Through the editorial choices around images and texts, Life was asking their readers, white, comfortably middle class, and likely urban dwellers, to become invested in the problems and pain of another part of the country, another demographic of the population. In their desire to foster the image of a homogenous post-war American middle class, Life's editors simultaneously assumed that the magazine's readers would be able to absorb messages of nationalism, capitalism, and optimism that the photographs presented. But this tension between the images and the text can almost always be found on Life's pages.
So we'll now move in, and that was a great segue, into this question of Life's photographic impact. When Life, the very first issue, it became an immediate success. The first issue sold out. It was incredibly popular. On this wall that you see here in the center, we have a 10-year anniversary issue where Life is doing a great job of sort of celebrating their own success. And then to the right, we have a case with 6 other magazines that were created after 1936 using basically the same sort of visual format of the red logo and a photograph as its cover. And so I want to just point out, studies suggest that the issues of the magazine regularly reached about 25% of the people in the United States, though its audience was largely comprised of white middle-class adults with high school or college education, as Kate alluded to. The formula of the picture magazine devised by Life was so popular that, as I pointed out, there were dozens of the copycat publications we just saw in the slide before. Readers of Life actively responded to the magazine's photographs, and we'll talk more about this in this section. They would write letters to the editor, purchase extra copies of special editions, and even offer financial assistance, as I mentioned in the case of Flavio, for specific photo essays. Life also perpetuated its own influence by repackaging its own photographs, obtaining exclusive rights or access to certain photos, and using its technical sophistication to outpace its competitors. Eventually, competition from television, as well as rising production and postage costs, forced the magazine to close as a weekly in December of 1972. So one of the examples of the magazine's photographic impact is related to this story on Tule Lake. The photograph in the upper left here shows American soldiers on the front lines reading, in World War II, 1944, reading issues of Life and Newsweek. And then the lower photograph on the left there is a photograph by Karl Maydanz, who photographed roll call during this is a photograph of the U.S. Army incarceration camp for Japanese and Japanese Americans in the United States in Tule Lake, California, 1944. What we see on the right is the report on the March 20th issue. So we really wanted to get into these reports and all of the things, how a story can create so many different responses and reactions. I want to just note the photograph of American soldiers in Burma. They are reading Life overseas, and we'll get to that, but they happen to be reading this very story, which is why the photograph is here. And so just to give you a sense of the story, Karl Maydanz's photo essay, which is several pages, it was published in a domestic issue of Life, and it shows a range of the experiences for the people that were interned at these camps. The discovery here for us was really all of the reader responses showed this very racist and xenophobic responses from the part of the largely white middle-class readership. And Life's internal reader report, which is a summary of all letters to the editor, noted 17 readers who, in spite of seeing Maydanz's photographs, Maidan's being sympathetic to the incarcerated, proclaimed that they, and this is a quote, hate all Japs and think they should be bombed. So this was a really intense discovery because of seeing all these reactions. In fact, I would say today it really likens when you read an article in the newspaper online and you have all these reactions after. I think there's an interesting parallel there with the letters to the editor. I want to point out these photographs are have a real range of what they show, but it overall is a very euphemistic way of presenting the these incarceration camps. And the second letter, I know it's going to be impossible to read from here, but the first letter talks about how it's unbiased, but the second letter here, which is much shorter, points to the fact that the stories being told by the people at these camps is radically different than the images we're seeing in Life magazine. And here we see examples of these reports. And then this was just an incredible find, so I want to show it again, the American soldiers reading this very issue, which was particularly powerful. And although we're not going into the contemporary moments in the exhibition in this setting, I did want to mention that out of the 3 contemporary artists in the exhibition, the first is Alfredo Jar, who's integrated into section 1 about how photographs are made. The second is Alexandra Bell, who really is thinking about editing biases, and she's integrated into section 2, or just between, right before section 2. And the third artist that we chose is Julia Wachtel. And this was a MFA commission, and we asked her to choose any aspect of Life magazine photography and to make a piece. So I invite you all to look at that installation. She ended up choosing photographs of the Manzanar incarceration camp, the U.S. Army. There were multiple camps, and so she focused on that, and so there's a connection there between these Tule Lake photographs and that contemporary piece. But back now to Life's sort of control and widely reaching ways of making great impact.
So we're back to the 1960s now. Here you're seeing on screen one frame of the so-called Zapruder film. I think that's how we mostly refer to it. This, amateur film made by a man named Abraham Zapruder, who was simply there to witness the Kennedy motorcade, but of course ended up capturing on film the assassination of John F. Kennedy. Within 24 hours of the assassination, the local bureau chief of Life magazine had secured exclusive rights for the Zapruder film images for Life magazine. And so this exclusivity is one of the ways in which Life maintained its photographic impact. And it's another piece of the story that we chart in this final section of the exhibition. So in the weekly issue that appears after the assassination, you see Life magazine making use of a number of the frames from this story, presenting them against a black background and presenting them, more or less, in an it's evocative of a sequence. So they're not exactly in sequence because they are skipping some frames, but it's presented in this sense that you have this idea of the film unfolding. They choose to omit the one frame that shows the bullet hitting Kennedy. But for us, the real discovery here rests on this internal memo, which is dated after that weekly issue I just showed you. It's dated November 26, 1963, and it's from Bernard Quint, who is one of the top editors at Life magazine. The memo is to George Hunt, who is the managing editor at that time. So this is to sort of the top of the pyramid, if you will. And he is talking about his dismay at Life's choice to publish these images, which he fears will scar the nation. And in fact, goes on to say, I think it's good enough I can read it. Let's see. He goes on to say, "It seems to me that this must surely involve an element of propriety and good taste, and the reputation of Life and its editors. I can't see how revealing any of the morbid details in color could serve any scientific or educational purpose, but rather help to feed those who are already morbid and depraved enough to derive excitement from it." And so the reason that this memo grabbed us, and this is one of the very first things I saw on my first visit to the New York Historical Society from that Time archive, is you have a layout editor here thinking through the difference between publishing these images in black and white versus color. And in fact, Bernard Quint goes on to say that should Life magazine choose to print these images in color, which at the time of his memo has not yet happened, he will be forced to resign. And I love that this is a glimpse into a staff that is thinking so deeply, right? Bernard Quint is not a photographer. He's not a film editor or negative editor. He's not a picture editor. This is someone thinking about the overall layout, the overall published page, and the impact it's gonna have on that 1/4 of the US population. And he is willing to stake his job on this idea, this claim of his, that these should not be published in color. And that memo to me reveals a kind of ethos of the place that was deeply photographic and thinking very much about these nuances, about how to publish, how big to publish, black and white versus color. Spoiler alert, they do go ahead and publish them in color. And what I'm showing you here is they published them in color 2 times after the assassination. And here I'm showing one of those where they choose a selection of the frames and then have these captions that detail what is going on in each frame. Another instance where they publish them in color is in the commemorative issue for JFK, which, a side note about impact, Kristen mentioned the raising of dollars. The proceeds from the JFK commemorative issue, I actually saw Jackie Kennedy's letter to Life's editors thanking them for the check for the proceeds, and that check became the foundation of the JFK Presidential Library.
So, still in the 60s here, the US ended the turbulent decade of the 1960s with the crowning achievement, beating the Soviet Union to the moon in the summer of 1969. It should be no great surprise at this point in our presentation of Life that this important role was obviously highly politicized endeavor, and Life began promoting NASA's space race activities to both its domestic and international readers in the late 1950s, when Life editors secured a long-term contract between the magazine and NASA astronauts. The contract mandated that any interviews or other articles covering the astronauts' lives beyond their official NASA duties would be published exclusively in Life. It's absolutely remarkable. Ralph Graves, the Life's managing editor, remarked in the spring of 1969 that for years, Life was the only news outlet to, quote, report and publicize the astronauts, their training, and NASA's space race program, and that, quote, Life's entire journalistic program during this period was aimed toward the eventual trip to the moon. They did a lot of that categorizing of themselves. So Life as a weekly could not capture the moon landing in real time, of course, and it was television, thank you, that served as the medium that first brought the historic event to the masses. An estimated 600 million people around the world tuned into their TVs to see the live transmission of Neil Armstrong and Buzz Aldrin on the moon via a black and white slow scan S-band television camera that the astronauts had brought along with them. Here, we see Don Beta's photograph of his wife and young daughter sitting inches away from their home TV to watch the American flag planted into the lunar surface. Newspapers that same night published low-quality images taken from the already grainy black and white TV transmission. Though life lacked the immediacy of television, the magazine was able to deliver the most impactful distillations of Apollo 11's historic moon landing. While on the moon, Armstrong and Aldrin shot 160 color photographs using a 70mm Hasselblad camera equipped with Kodak's Ektachrome color film. Once the astronauts landed back on Earth, the film was briefly quarantined for safety reasons before being distributed to the press. Here we see a selection, and you'll see these color transparencies from the transparencies made from the Life Picture Collection ones that we decided to include on a light box so that people would again have a sense of the actual objects that editors were working with. Here we see the August 8th cover where Life first printed a color photograph of the American flag on the moon as its cover, And there's also the interior story. They had the August 11th special issue, which was a 96-page advertisement-free commemorative issue, which was far superior than any of its competitors. Beyond printing 30 color images taken by the Apollo 11 astronauts using high color quality ink, they also used their NASA contract to have biographical profiles and photographs taken of the astronauts over the years. And again, sort of showing their ability to control so many images. Here we also see in their 1960s Decade in Review double issue published 4 months later on December 26, 1969, that the magazine's editors confirmed that the moon landing was both a highlight for the country and for the magazine, which during a time that seemed to be a decade of tumult and change. And with that, I'll move to...
Well, 1969 ended on this nationalistic high of the moon landing, and Life showed that it could, in fact, still compete with the growing popularity of television and more inexpensively produced publications. The coming years would prove to be a continuing challenge for the nation and for the magazine. So television was one key provocation in Life's reckonings with itself throughout the 1960s, and it was also the major competitor to all of the major picture magazines in the US and Europe, not only for people's attention, but also importantly for advertising dollars. This, together with rising postage rates and production costs, and the increase in subscribers that began in late 1969 with the acquisition of the Saturday Evening Post's mailing list, led to Life's demise. And here I'm showing you the New York Times front page and a detail of it, announcing that Life is going to cease publication on December 29th. So this was front page news for the New York Times. And I have to say, one of the really wonderful and deeply rewarding aspects of working at the New York Historical Society was going through hundreds, if not 1,000, of the letters that the editors chose to keep. Here, 2 from Life's younger readers. Have to say I love the way the drawing on the right really captures a whole range of sort of circa 1972 personas. But also letters from other, newsmen and newswomen around the country from other news outlets. Here, Pacific Daily News. But this is the one that I will leave you with, and I will read this. Dear sir, it is with sadness that I just learned of the news that your magazine is going out of business. This is dated 8th December, right? The final issue is not until December 29th. So perhaps this news was read on that New York Times front page I just showed. Life meant something very special to me because on April 27, 1953, you printed an article on Hamilton College. I was then a high school girl in France, And I wrote and asked one of the young men featured in the article to be my pen pal, ... Last summer, we celebrated our 16th wedding anniversary. Thank you, life. And it's signed by Andrea Levy. She then gets a custom letter, which was next to this original letter in the file at New York Historical Society from one of the editors at Life, writing, you'll notice, from his home address after Life magazine has been dissolved to acknowledge her very touching letter to the magazine. And so here, the final issue, which I think tellingly does not feature a photograph. It's this kind of word salad, ending with the word goodbye under the final date. But of course, I think the editors here realizing that there was no photograph that could sum up what Life as a weekly photo magazine had been, and that this was really the best they could do for their farewell issue.
And so in this moment, when we have photographs on our devices at all times, it feels like a particularly important moment to think about how groundbreaking news through photography began to shape the way we remember things collectively and individually, and sort of how narratives are created about world events. And so we're happy to take questions, and we hope you'll get to see the exhibition if you haven't seen it already, and also hope you'll have a chance to look over the book and hear a lot more about all of these discoveries. So we're happy for questions.
I have a microphone here. If anyone has a question, just raise your hand high and I will get to you.
Were the photographers on staff to Life as salaried employees, or were they all independents who just got jobs when Life came up with an idea for a story?
It was both, that there were, it was definitely a status question. So Life salaried photographers definitely had the most comfortable situation because they got salaries, they were supported in a great deal with great generosity on behalf of Life. And then there were many, many freelance photographers that would just get paid per story, or would propose stories, or would get approached through an agency they worked through. So there were many different ways, but there's certainly sort of a core Life staff photographers.
And there's a fun example in the first section of the exhibit where you can actually see the story that Gordon Parks went in and pitched to Life's editors, went and got the photos, delivered the story, and it secures him a spot as a staff photographer. So you actually can see one of the assignments that sort of changed someone from that independent to staff.
So thank you for a really great presentation. Really enjoyed it, very informative. Regarding the original intellectual property of all of these pictures, which is basically the negatives themselves and what the photographers produced directly, what did Life ever end up doing with all those negatives? Are most of them gone, or are they in archives somewhere?
So as I mentioned at the start, the photographic components are part of the Life Picture Collection, which is still privately, corporately held. This includes the negatives, which have all been digitized now and cataloged. It includes contact sheets. It includes the caption files, because those caption files were never separated right from the photographic elements. It includes all of the press prints, and am I missing anything? I think that's everything. And those, but it's important to say that from story to story, different amounts of any of those categories still exist. So, for example, for like Larry Burroughs photographing Vietnam War in color, his color negatives exist, but there's no physical prints, because in color they were working from transparencies, and there wasn't that sort of intermediary step. So there's different amounts that remain in the archive, and depending on the photographer, to the earlier question, depending on their status, whether they were contract, freelance, or staff, the rights to the photographs differ. So to this day, we have to check with Life Picture Collection, not just photographer by photographer, but assignment by assignment, to find out where the rights rest. So there's no easy answer to that question. And it is, something that Life Picture Collection is still, very actively pursuing today.
Thank you for that very interesting overview. I was curious if you know whether the editor did quit after they published the photos in color.
He didn't. But I love that he staked his job on it. But he doesn't quit. I searched for his name in subsequent issues, and he does stay on.
And I've often wondered, did he justify that to himself because it was a commemorative issue and it wasn't the weekly? And, surely there were some really interesting conversations had at that time that we would have all loved to be a fly on the wall about.
Did either of you find evidence that the government pressured the magazine to present a certain point of view?
That's a great question. Kate thought of one example, the Flavio, and I'm thinking of another one, the Women in Steel. Yeah. So I think something really important to think about is the Office of War Information was a very active body in the United States, and they had their own photographers, they had their own, basically they were an information agency. And so there are tons of memos where OWI is writing to Life, making recommendations. There's a lot of back and forth, and I'm thinking first of the Women in Steel story, which you'll see in the exhibition by Margaret Burke-White, where there's a memo sent from OWI to Life magazine saying, we really want you to photograph women working in industry right now, like female labor during the war while men are fighting. And Life was sort of offended and responded like, we're already on it, I think that often the loudest editorial voices were often in alignment with the US government. So I wouldn't say there was a ton of tension, but those types of things, there's absolutely very open correspondence about that. And I think this is a little separate from Life magazine, but shows how important war efforts are. At MoMA, there was even like an Army Services Department. And so, there was a lot of close connections between governments, museums, and the press, for sure.
I was just gonna add the Flavio story that Kristen talked about, and it's the only story for which we found those mock-ups. Those are the only known mock-ups of any pages of any Life magazine anywhere known today. That story of Flavio, Gordon Parks, in his own autobiography, talks about feeling so passionately about his first coverage of Flavio, when he shows Flavio suffering an asthma attack. That first coverage, Life isn't gonna run the story. And he threatens to quit. This is a theme. He threatens to quit, and the story Gordon Parks relays in his autobiography is that the State Department calls Life and says, do a story that's about the threat communism poses, do it and do it immediately. And so they revive this story about poverty in the favelas in Rio as an anti-communist story, and Gordon Parks keeps his job.
Thank you so much for joining us today, and thank you, Kristen and Katherine.
Thank you all. Thank you.